Hello, everyone. Hi, my name is Isi, Professor Israel Doron, and I would like to welcome you all to my presentation on the human right to leisure in old age. With your permission, I would like to open with a few words, and I would like to naturally begin with saying thanks to the wonderful organizers of this excellent conference. I'm very thankful for them, not only for inviting me, but also for allowing me to make this presentation on video and not in person. So thank you very much, and I congratulate all the participants for coming and attending this excellent conference on independent aging. Naturally, I would like to continue with an apology. I planned to be in person. I would have loved to come over and to give you in person and meet you all. However, unfortunately, due to the terrible events in my country, in the horrific attack by the terrorist Hamas group in Gaza, I will not be able to make it to the conference. In this context, I would like to finish this part by dedicating this presentation to this older woman you see in the picture, Ella Adar, 85 years old, a woman from one of the kibbutzim bordering Gaza. No, she's not on a safari. No, she's not exercising her human right to leisure. She's actually has been brutally attacked and taken hostage and is now in Gaza under the hands of the terrorist group of Hamas. I believe that everyone who listens to my presentation today should realize and acknowledge the war crimes, massacres, and the brutal slaughter of innocent people, including many elderly, that Palestinians, Hamas, have conducted. And thus, I call you all to support Israel in its struggle to protect its citizens in general, but in specific to protect the human rights of elderly, innocent Israelis around Gaza. So after this unpleasant opening, I would like to move to my presentation. So why do we talk about human rights to leisure in old age? Why is it important? Why is it relevant to this conference? I would like to argue that in general, and there's already wealth of literature in this issue, there's a unique situation of the human rights of older persons, generally speaking. On the one hand, there is a wealth of what we call soft law instruments. For example, what is known as MIPA, the Madrid International Plans of Action on Aging, and many more international declarations, documents, policy papers who describe the importance and the need for human rights instruments of older persons on the one hand. But on the other hand, unfortunately, still, and unlike women, children, persons with disabilities, we do not have an internationally binding human rights convention for the rights of older persons. Hence, me and many others in the last 15 years at least have been struggling on the international arena in general and at the UN General Assembly and the UN Open-Ended Working Group in specific to promote and advance and create a new international convention for the rights of older persons. Unfortunately, so far we've been unsuccessful. More specifically, there is a clear need to be more accurate about what do we mean in the term of human rights of older persons, and why isn't it enough to have the protection of human rights of older persons within the general frameworks of existing human rights instruments. So what are the normative gaps? What is the justification? What do we mean specifically when we talk about human rights of older persons? So this was actually the background of this presentation. It's based on a master thesis by one of my students, Iris Karev, a thesis that was published as you see below. And basically, this presentation is based on this publication, which you are all invited to read in length and in full. And this is yet another opportunity to thank Iris Carre for her excellent work and her research in her master thesis. So let's dive into the issue. What do we mean in the term leisure? Do we view in our imagination the picture like we see healthy older people play ping pong, or resting on a pool somewhere around the world, or traveling to Japan to simply enjoy Tokyo or Kyoto and enjoy leisure in a hotel or around the pool or on the seaside? Well, interestingly enough, the answer to the question, what do we mean in the term leisure, is not simple, because a precise definition of the concept of leisure is actually quite elusive. And dictionary definitions of the term also vary. For example, one may define leisure as the condition of having one's time free from the demands of work or duty. Or another example is time when one is not working, or freedom provided by the cessation of activities, or freedom from occupation, of business, simply vacant time, and many more. So as you can see, simply from a dictionary perspective, there are many different definitions. Reviewing the existing definition and literature in the field, however, suggests that there are actually three different conceptual perspectives to leisure, and this is the model we're going to use in this presentation. So the first conceptual perspective is what we call the negative and temporal nature of leisure. And what do we mean? We mean the negative and temporal aspect of leisure focuses on the negative construction of activity, not having to do something. It is the idea that leisure is a period of time that exists in relation to, and indeed in the absence of, other mandatory engagements or obligations, which work is naturally the most clear and natural example for this. However, there's another dimension to leisure, and that is actually the positive and active of leisure. So while the negative and temporal conception of leisure is the most straightforward, the positive aspect recognizes that leisure constitutes not only the absence of obligation, but also positive and active qualitative aspects which take place. So this positive active conception of leisure anchors the terms in what individual does in the absence of obligations. So leisure has characterized as opportunity to engage, to be active, to participate. So finally, the last and third, and maybe the most interesting and novel aspect of leisure and the right to leisure, is actually the cognitive and intrinsic nature of leisure. So while both previous perspectives on leisure define themselves in terms of relative to other activities, so free time compared to time spent on obligation, meaningful activities which are not motivated by necessity, the third definition is not relative. Leisure is an activity which has a quality in and by itself. In the cognitive intrinsic conception, leisure is a state of mind characterized by an unobligated time of thinking, reflection, and internal optimism of what to do. So once we explore what do we mean and the three dimensions of leisure, the next question is naturally, what do we mean in the term a human right to leisure? And interestingly enough, in Article 24 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948, states the following: everyone has the right to rest and leisure, including reasonable working hours and periodic holidays with pay. This is naturally a very, very interesting definition of the human right to leisure, because this article actually represents the historical understanding of the right to leisure within modern times. it emerged from the identification of a threat to human dignity, basically being overworked. So it was this labor law right which was advanced on the international level into the right of leisure. Or in other words, the right to leisure is basically the right not to work to death. So this is the historical understanding of the right to leisure, or what, as we previously conceptualized, the negative right. However, we know that the UNDHR is not a binding document. So when we look into the right to leisure in the binding hard international law, the picture is actually very limited. In most human rights binding documents, the right to leisure does not exist as such, or it is very marginal. It's very, very marginal. So for example, the right to leisure is reaffirmed in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. However, Article 9, which refers to the right to leisure, does so solely with the context of favorable work condition, which includes the right to rest, leisure, and reasonable limitation of working hours. So once again, we see this conceptualization of the human right to leisure within the context of labor law rights. So what is the human right to leisure in the context of old age? So what do we mean, not only generally the human right to leisure, but specifically in the context of human right to leisure in old age? So within this context, once again, a very, very limited international recognition to the human right of leisure. Once again, the question is, what do we mean specifically in the context of older persons? Or more specifically, to what extent is there a recognition to, if you see of all the headlines that on your right, so literature which shows that leisure activity reverses memory, aging in older adults, a study that reveals the power of social participation in old age, or a study that shows that leisure activities may improve longevity for older adults. So where does all this empirical data and knowledge that we know today about the empirical of active aging, of meaningful aging, of successful aging in the context of leisure activities, how do they reflect or appear in actual human rights documents which refer to the human rights of older persons? So for this matter, we conducted a research actually, basically going over 17 well-known international human rights documents, both soft and hard law, which refer to specifically human rights of other persons, and try to look to what extent the human right to leisure appears in there. So, what are the key findings of this study? First of all, in the majority of all documents, there was no mention at all to leisure as such, and no specific accreditation to the human right to leisure of older persons. Second, in this context, it is also interesting to know that even in the most significant soft law document, i.e. MIPA, the Madrid International Plan of Action on Aging, the right to leisure as such is not mentioned at all. In other documents and more recent documents, for example, the Organization of American States Convention on the Protection of Human Rights of Older Persons, they mention and refer to leisure only as an instrumental and dependent right, meaning combined with other rights, or as an instrument to achieve other rights. So, for instance, the right to leisure as part of the right to social participation or the right to recreation, but not as a right within itself in all the three dimensions that I mentioned before. And interestingly, in almost all international human rights documents examined, where leisure is directly referred to, the reference is made within our second conceptual construct only, meaning the positive active aspect of leisure, and not in the negative or in its intrinsic aspects. So there is no holistic representation of all three aspects of leisure in old age in general. In the majority of cases, there's no reference to human right to leisure in old age anywhere or in any case at all as such. So if this is the reality, what would I like to argue for this conference and for this audience? I would like to propose the following insights of the findings of my research. First of all, and foremost, there is a need to recognize the human right to leisure in old age in all of its three dimensions. Negative, so freedom from work in old age. Positive, the human right to meaningful and serious participation in active and meaningful leisure in all its forms. And finally, the human right to recognition to cognitive leisure, to solitude, the right to be left alone with one's minds, feelings, and thoughts in a free way. Secondly, we need to be freed from the historical link between the right to leisure in old age and leisure as a right in labor, or more specifically, in the context of old age, the development of the concept of retirement and pension. Look, the assurance of the right to retire in dignity or simply to have social security in old age is undoubtedly a very important human right. However, this should not preclude the efforts to directly and specifically protect the right to leisure in old age. And finally, I think, again, in the broader context of the struggle to establish a new international convention for human rights, we need to avoid becoming ageists in our arguments within the right to leisure in old age, and to transform this potentially ageist argument into actually an ageivist argument or a social activism perspective. So what I'm trying to say, again, those who continue to ask, but why do we need the specific human right to leisure in old age? Why do we need specific human rights for older persons? I think we should realize that first of all, the protection of specific classes of population is well established in the human rights law, for example, in women and children, persons with disability. So in other words, we do have an understanding that we need, alongside the universal human rights instruments, specific instruments in light of the fact that the universalistic documents are not sufficient to address the specific nuance and intersectional interest and aspects of human rights for older persons in general, and specifically in the realm of total absence or very little relations to the human rights of leisures. Specifically, we need to understand this in light of the importance and significance of leisures to older persons as such. Secondly, I think that in the reality of the universality of aging in general and the centrality of the social demographic revolution of the aging of our society, advancing the human right to leisure of older persons will actually serve as a basis for a universalistic approach to leisure in general. So to conclude, I think we are still in an international stage of struggle to establish a new, specific, and dedicated international convention for the rights of older persons in order to allow independent aging as example in the theme of this important conference. Second, within the context of this theme of the conference, there cannot be independent aging without an international recognition of human rights of older persons in general, and within any new human rights convention, the human rights to leisure in all of its three dimensions needs to be addressed and recognized in order to ensure true emancipation and independence in old age. So thank you very much. And unfortunately, once again, I will conclude this presentation with prayers to the quick release of El Hadar and all the hostages held by the terrorist Palestinians, Hamas in Gaza, and peace to us all. Thank you very much.